adding to this, so I get my hands in a lot of different things. I've been at this a long time. So Michelle mentioned one thing. I just want to correct a little bit. I was actually born in London.
Clicker is not working.
So my father went to. Is everything okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My father went to London to do a PhD in the 1960s.
64.
And right afterwards, I was born there. But our family came to the U.S. when I was 2 years old. So London, and then we came to the U.S. And the middle picture there on the left is Boston. Lived in the Northeast, upstate New York, and Massachusetts for my whole life, basically. And then just in the last 2 years, we moved down to, I don't need the clicker, I'll just do this, it's fine, it's fine. And then the last 2 years, we moved down to Florida. So that last picture is Miami. We're north of Miami. And yes, my kids are all grown up, 32, 30, 28. So I'll be turning 57 next month. Everything that you can imagine is a team effort, right? People do not do things alone. They do things with other people, and they do things motivated by other people. So when you hear the phrase, standing on the shoulder of giants, I have many, many, many people who have influenced me, right? So you can see some of the names at the top there, Swami Vivekananda, Dharampal, Ramsuru. And remember, you can think of me, parents, you can think of me as your kids, right? I grew up in this country, and I had not a very traditional, religious family. They were not into this stuff at all. I did this completely, 100% on my own, just out of curiosity. That's literally it. As a child growing up, I heard stuff at school, I heard stuff in society. I thought it was absolutely terribly wrong, and just out of curiosity, I did my own studies. So these are some of the people I read, some of the archaeologists. You may recognize the name B.P. Lal, S.R. Rao, G.P. Singh. There's a fellow in India right now, Shrikant Talagiri, doing fantastic historical work. I put the name Francois Gautier in red. He actually is a French guy who came to India with the intention of converting Hindus to Christianity, but after living in India and learning about Dharma, he did a 180. And he became Hindu, and he married an Indian woman, and became an Indian and lives in India. And he actually had some problems putting together a museum of real Indian history. This is a project going back like 30 years. He wanted to make something called a Hindu Holocaust Museum, because the Holocaust of Hindus was much worse than the Holocaust of Jews. Most people aren't even aware of it. It's absolutely sad that people aren't even aware of it, let alone we don't do something about it. He tried to put that museum together, and he was attacked by a local politician and his goons. Around that time, I contacted him on the internet and said, let's go about this and do it a little more smart. Long story short, he has a museum in Pune. I have my content over there, and we're working to improve that museum, and eventually we're going to make cookie-cutter museums all over India, telling the real history of India. Michelle Danino, Nicholas Kazanis. Now you'll notice down there Vishal. Vishal is what I like to call my local encyclopedia. So when I don't know things, I ask Vishal, and I don't know how he remembers it all. Rajiv Malhotra, how many people have heard of that name, Rajiv Malhotra? He's doing fantastic work. He produces a book a year. He's tremendous. And he's really challenging academic authority. And academia is very powerful. Don't underestimate it. You could go up and say, hey, I don't like this, and people have the power almost to silence you, because they have huge political power, huge money power. So we need to topple these people. We're in the progress of doing that. It's been a 30-year battle. We've probably got 30 more years to topple them. Conrad Elst, one of my good friends, and Shankaracharya. And there's many names. I apologize if I left some off. There's so many people doing good work. All right, questions about Indian history. I don't know if the kids, you know this. I don't know what they teach you in school. They probably teach you almost nothing. But the parents, you may have heard this. How many people have heard of the Aryan Invasion? Okay, people heard of it? Yeah, it's completely false. Did the Aryan invasions create the racist caste system? This is some of the nonsense they teach. It's all a divide and conquer, by the way. Are Aryans divided in two distinct races? How many people have heard this? Complete nonsense. You can actually look today with genetic studies, and you can see common Indic genes. All right, is the word Hindu an exonym? Actually, it comes after Sapta Sindhu civilization. Sapta Sindhu civilization, right? People always talk about Indus Valley, or sometimes people say Harappan, which is named after one city. It's Sapta Sindhu civilization. And by the way, we should call ourselves by the names we call ourselves. In our own texts, we say Sapta Sindhu. That's the ancient name of our civilization. Sindhu, the Persians who came couldn't pronounce S. They could only say Ha. So they pronounced Sapta Sindhu as Hapta Hindu. And that's where the name came from. Was the Islamic period peaceful and syncretic? Absolutely not. Absolutely. It was a Holocaust. It was a Holocaust. And it lasted for over 1,000 years, and some would say it's still going on. Was India actually invented by the British? This is such a ridiculous idea, I have a hard time even saying the sentence, but some people proposed this idea. Actually, India is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. If you look at the four cradles of civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China. India is the oldest because what happened to Egypt? Right? First they became Greek and Roman, then they became Christian, now they're Islamic. What happened to Mesopotamia? That's Iraq. What happened to China? It's communist. There's no religion allowed. In a communist, Marxist country, no religion allowed. So all those civilizations have fallen. They've completely collapsed. The only one standing is India. And then last one, does India have a future? I have some final slides on this which will surprise you. All right, so let me talk about a couple things. Reality, which probably nobody presents to you. Reality. Original civilization started on rivers. Rivers were the ancient highways of commerce. Okay, and the rivers where you can grow a lot of food and support a population. And that's how you get civilization. Civilization came about very slowly. It was not like somebody snapped a finger and so they became civilized. It was very slow. Humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens, we were kind of dwelling in the jungle, hunting, gathering, and doing this for a very long time, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Slowly we became civilized. Okay, so the misunderstandings, Aryan Invasion, migration, I'll talk about this and tell you why it's not only incorrect, but what really happened is people slowly migrated out of part of India, and that's how the culture and dharma and Sanskrit and everything spread. People have equated caste with apartheid. Once again, complete nonsense, but they're using these techniques to trick people, to brainwash people, into getting them to hate each other. It's a very powerful tool. If you can trick enough people to be against each other, then you can do a divide and conquer. Okay, next thing, Saraswati River. How many people have heard of Saraswati River? How many people have heard that it's a mythical river? It's mythology, it's a story. Yeah, it was an actual river. It was actually a very powerful river. We have physical evidence of that river. You can drill underground in Rajasthan and other places and actually go down at a certain depth and collect that water. Okay, so it was a reality. Now, when that river dried up or desiccated, it was a huge tragedy. Imagine if the Mississippi River dried up tomorrow. What would happen? What would happen if the Mississippi River completely dried up tomorrow? Commerce would shut down on the river because there's no river anymore, and people would leave. Some people would go to the east, and some people would go to the west. That's exactly what happened. Okay, and where are the names of people before Buddha? I don't know what school is like today, but when I was a kid in the history book, there was no names of people before Buddha. There was this vague notion that there's this Indus Valley civilization, no names, and then all of a sudden we have Buddha. Really? Really? No names. The idea I thought was so ridiculous that even as a child I had to laugh at it. Okay, now distortions. Has anybody heard the word itihas? Itihas means thus it was. It's history. It's history. And sometimes it's actually been counted in present tense. Here I am, fighting this king along this river. Here's my troops. There are their troops. Here's how the battle went. Present tense. But people describe it sometimes as mythology. Okay, and then there's some other things like the Ram banishment. I'm not going to get into all that in this presentation, but there's a lot of details that are distortions. So here's the rough chronology that I have in my timeline. Now, how do I put this together? Once again, I started with curiosity. When I got to college, I was around 18, 19 years old. So this was 1984, 1985. So in college was the first time I had access to academic libraries. So this was like a world of knowledge to me. And I started doing research and I found out, oh my goodness, there's all this history, there's all this information that is not public knowledge. Let's put this together in a simple way and let's get this out. So this is roughly my timeline. So it started with the Manvantara dynasty, or the dynasty of Manu. Then you get Emperor Bharata. So Emperor Bharata is where we get the name Bharat. Anybody here in the news that India is officially changing the name to Bharat? That's what we call ourselves internally, right? Just like people say Deutschland internally, externally Germany. Nippon internally for Japan, externally Japan. So likewise it's Bharat. Now, you'll notice there in red I put down epic 1, 2, and 3. This is probably news to most of you. Most of you have heard of two epics, right? Ramayana and Mahabharata. Am I right? Ramayana and Mahabharata. How many people have heard of Dasharajnya? Raise your hand. Aha! This is important. Dasharajnya. Dasha means 10, Rajya means kings, or in some cases tribal chieftains. So, the War of 10 Kings. This was written up clearly in the Rig Veda and a few other texts. And I like to consider this epic number 1. And the reason why it's important to give it the status of epic is because it was a pivot point. It changed Indian history. And I would say if you change Indian history, you're changing world history. Then we get Mahavir Buddha. And notice I put down there, history begins here, question mark. In our textbooks, and I don't know what you guys have in school today, if it's the same nonsense we had, they'll make it look like the names of people in the history starts with Buddha. which is ignoring like 90% of Indian history. It's shocking. Imagine if you studied Egyptian history and you ignored every single pharaoh and said there were some people who lived here, and so let's start with the Greeks and Romans. Emperor Ashoka, and once again, see, I use the word emperor, I don't use the word king. Very specific meaning. Emperor is a different word than king. Gupta dynasty, now we get Islamic invasions, Shishya Dharma, rise of Sikhism. Early European trade, I'm going to talk about Europe, because people in India always talk about the British. Long before the British were the Europeans. And then finally political independence, which is not complete. So I took this information and I put it in, I just started writing notes on paper. And then eventually I started writing lists of names on paper. And then after many, many years I said, you know what, let me put this in an Excel spreadsheet. And I put it in an Excel spreadsheet. And then like 10 years later now, in 1994, the internet comes out. And my researchers skyrocketed. And I said, you know what, let me take my spreadsheets and let me start emailing it to people. And let me create some websites and post this stuff. And that's why websites have all, you can download all of this stuff. Over 300 generations, that's the link up there. I built the spreadsheet backwards. Backwards. Who did I start with? Me. I started with what I knew. I knew me, I knew my father, I knew my grandparents. I talked to my parents and grandparents and found out about previous generations, and that's how I started, and I built it backwards. And I made an assumption of roughly 25 years per generation. Now today that changes. Today people are getting married later, they're having kids later, everything's changing, but for most of history, 25 years a generation is a good estimate, which means 4 generations in 1 century. I compared it to other civilizations, and it lines up very well. I did a cross-correlation of royal dynasties and priestly dynasties. All the most powerful kings had their own priests, and those priests were in families, they were purohits, and we have their lineage too. I added in different events throughout history. A lot of times when you see people studying Indian history, or just history in general, they're very obsessed with events. But events always happen in a context. A context of what happened before that event, what happened during that event, and what happened after that event. Always please keep that in mind. I synchronized this with archaeological data. I applied a little common sense. Like if we had 5 people with the same name, separated by 3,000 years, they're not the same person. So I labeled that in my chart. There might be Rama 1, Rama 2, Rama 3, Rama 4, because people had similar names. Like my name's Neeraj. How many Neerajas are there in Indian history? I don't know, 1,000? And then you can download this. Now, wouldn't it be nice to have a physical representation of all this history? Because as much as I like to read and I like to write, most people don't, right? I'm looking at your kids. How many of your fellow kids love to read and write? Okay, you guys are exceptions. Most kids like to watch a 5-minute video, right? They don't have an attention span to go beyond 5-minute video. So it's nice to have a physical representation of all of this. So that person I told you about, Francois Gauthier, he needed some help, so I'm helping him with his museum in Pune. It's over 5 acres. We helped him with the landscaping. An entire pavilion there is my content. And it's coming along very well. So I'm going to go over a few of those panels. So the panels, think of it like a poster, like a 3-foot by 5-foot poster. And in each panel, I'll give a little bit of Indian history. This is an example of what some of the panels look like. And you'll see some of the incredible people in Indian history. So first of all, geography. If anybody studied geography, you know that on this planet, all these plates, all this land we're on is moving. Everything's moving. These are tectonic plates and they're moving. And what is India used to be in Antarctica. And as it broke away, it started sliding up, it slammed into Asia. And it's still slamming into Asia right now. And so that's why the Himalayas are there. The Himalayas are growing. I don't forget if it's 1 millimeter or 2 or 3 millimeters a year. But the Himalayas are growing because India keeps slamming into Asia. And geography is important. Geography in some ways is destiny, right? Because India was surrounded by mountains to the north and to the northwest, and because it was surrounded by water everywhere else, it was very protected against attack. So for 4, 5, 6,000 years, India did not have any major incursions. And thus, the civilization was able to become very developed, very sophisticated, and very rich, okay? Later on, when I say later, you started around 800 BC, then you started to get some minor incursions. Oh, and by the way, talking about ethnicity, because people were all together, and they intermarried, and they moved around, our DNA shares commonality. So you can find people from different parts of India, and there is genes you can look at that'll show, hey, this person's from South Asia or Greater India. So all this stuff about separate races is nonsense. Just because people look slightly different doesn't mean they're separate races. All right, so when does all the farming start? So there were some theories that farming was invented in one place, Mesopotamia, and then spread from there, but now we know that farming developed independently in different areas. One of the earliest places it developed was along the Saraswati River and along the western part of India, and we have that information. Also along the Ganga, we found some rice growing very, very early on. So if we go back about 10,000 years, was kind of good evidence we have of farming. Now, was there farming before then? Maybe, but we have evidence for about 10,000 years. Now we have a city, Murugan. Now once again, people probably haven't talked about this much. They talk about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, but long before then was Murugan. And there you can see how well laid out the city is. You can see some little figurines. This was a city. This was not a village. This was not a town. I think at its peak it had something like over 25,000 people, which is a very large population then. How many people have heard of Bharat? Right? So notice I call him emperor. I don't call him king. Words are very important. When the British took over India, they changed every king's name to prince. Prince. Why did they do that? They subverted them because they wanted the king to be in England, or the queen to be in England, right? So words are important. Words are not unimportant. So it's emperor. So he was able to defeat a whole bunch of kings in northern India. He became powerful over them, and thus, even today, we name the country after him. He was a real person, and there is real lineage. All right, this is what I call epic number one. So written up in the Rig Veda and some other texts is what we call the War of 10 Kings. There was a descendant of Emperor Bharat, and his name was Sudas, and he was growing very powerful. And because of his power, his neighboring kings, and off in the distance of what is today Afghanistan, tribal chieftains were very nervous. And they said, there's no way we can beat this guy, he's too powerful. So let's form a confederacy, let's all work together. All of these dozen or so, it was actually slightly more than 10, all of these dozens or so kings and tribal chieftains, and let's all simultaneously attack him. Let's attack him, let's destroy every city, let's kill him, let's take over. And guess what? They tried multiple times over a multi-year period, and he defeated them all. And his priests highly praised Sudas, and those eulogies, those praise to him, is written down in the Rig Veda. So this was a turning point of Indian history, because this dynasty, which is called the Puru Bharata dynasty, if Sudas was killed and if he lost his empire, everything would have ended there, someone else would have taken over. But he continued. So then we get the dynasty from there called the Ramayana. How many people have heard of Ramayana? Okay. How many people know there's archaeological evidence for the Ramayana? Okay, so this is not mythology, this is history. Now, when we say the word mythology or stories, think of it this way. Think of it as a layer cake. A layer cake. You guys are familiar with a layer cake. Who doesn't love cake? So imagine at the bottom of it you have history. But after the event happened, people were telling stories. And over generation, the stories got bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the end of the day, thousands of years later, we remember the stories, and we forgot what the original history was. But there is an original history. Now, what is the epic after Ramayana? Mahabharata, right? Oh, wait a minute. We have to interrupt the presentation. We have to interrupt. What happened? There was an invasion. What kind of invasion? An Aryan invasion. So this is how ridiculous I feel this whole theory is. And this is essentially codified in all your history books. They say around 1500 BC, there were these Aryan people who were what? A bunch of blonde Germans? What? People who invaded. They rushed over the mountains in these horse-drawn chariots, which if anybody's been in a horse-drawn chariot, you know that's humorous. They conquered everybody. By the way, they were uncivilized savages, but they brought with them horses, chariots, Sanskrit. They brought with them Hinduism, which is nothing more than a racist caste system. And they brought the Vedas, and they brought the swastika symbol. All of this stuff is complete nonsense, but it got codified in history books, and people still eat it up today and use it for political means. So what really happened? Well, what really happened was this. Remember I said that long before the British were the Europeans. So when the Europeans came to India, and this is now going back like the 1400s, they listened to the languages, and they said, you know, I can hear words, a lot of words, that are very similar to our European words. Like not 5 or 10 words, but like 100 words plus that are similar to our European words. How can that be possible? How can a language have that many similarities? There has to be some relation. And there's only 3 ways you can have a relationship. People from Europe went in some ancient period and came into India and brought the language. That theory was thrown out immediately because Europe was much younger. People from India went and traveled northwest and brought with them the language, and that's how the words and the language got over there. That theory was initially the most popular theory. Today we call that the out of India theory, but that was just considered common sense initially. And then there was a third theory that maybe somebody in the middle, like southern Russia, this is what we call the Caucasian Mountains. This is where the word Caucasian comes from, by the way. People in the Caucasian Mountains went both directions, to the east and to the west, and they spread their language. So initially, the idea that people from India went and brought and took with them the language and the culture and all this, that was the original dominant theory. Slowly over time, politics got involved and also some misunderstandings, and people said, no, it has to be a middle point. The real thing must be a middle point, and then people in both directions. Now the problem is, the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence doesn't support that. The evidence supports, if you look at, it's hard to see in the lower right there, the evidence supports people from India going outwards. And you can see that not only in the way that the words conjugate, you can see kind of the history of the conjugation of words, you can also see it through genetics, okay? And there's also literary evidence. There's no literature in India that says people came from outside and that's who we are. But there is evidence, people in India wrote, some of our ancestors left and went this way. And by the way, the Persians have part of that history. The Persians described Sapta Sindhu as Hapta Hindu. And they said, that's where our ancestors come from. So there was a history of this in writing, very clearly, what direction people went. So people get very confused by this Aryan concept. And even today, you'll find these people who will propose this as if it's some racist theory. It's not. It's not. It's a culture. It's a language. But they'll make up this concept, oh, these were German Aryans. Actually, if anybody studies the history of Germany, you'll know that this appearance, this doesn't come from Germany. This is Nordic. All right, and if you look at the right side, see that? That's a hair color. People of Europe. This blonde hair comes from Scandinavia, not from Germany. A lot of Germans have brown hair, or even some have black hair. It's nothing to do with Germany, and actually has nothing to do with Scandinavia. It has to do with people from India. So if we go back in time and look at those people who migrated out of India, did they look like the guy on the left? Probably not. Did they look like the guy on the right? Probably. Okay? Now, we also talk about swastika, and people say, oh, and maybe it's better now. Okay, I'm talking to kids. Maybe it's better now. When I was a kid, it was a bad scene. It was like, oh my God, you can never say the word swastika. You can never draw the symbol because Jews will get offended. Jews will get offended. And I thought, what? Then why do we have this symbol thousands of years ago? And they're talking about what happened in World War II, which is more recent. Well, what's going on here? So this symbol is a very ancient symbol. And the ones that the Germans have is actually called Heigen Cross, which means a hooked cross. Okay? Hooked cross. That's actually their symbol. And they use it for what? They use it during World War II, so it's a period of 40 years. So is it fair for somebody to misuse a symbol for 40 years and that to negate over 5,000 years of someone's good usage of that symbol? Absolutely not. Look at the cross in the middle. Is the cross a symbol of evil? Is the cross a symbol of murder? Well, that's what it was for the KKK. So they denigrated a symbol that was sacred for 2,000 years, and they misused it for less than 100 years. But we don't outlaw the cross just because the KKK misused it. So we should never outlaw swastika because the Nazis misused it for a very short period of time, okay? And this message needs to get to every single Jew in America. Here's another problem with this whole Aryan theory, it's complete nonsense. They said, well, these white people came in and they conquered the blackies, and as they intermarried with the blacks, you get some people who are off-white, some people who are beige, some people who are tan, some people who are brown, some people who are dark brown, and then some people who never mixed or black. So they turned it into a racist theory. And then they said, well, the people at the top kept all the power. So those were the Brahmins. They kept the power. And then next to them are all the kings, the Kshatriyas. And the word Kshatriya, you notice it's very close to the English word knight, which also has the silent K, similar word, knight. Somebody protects the land. Kshatriya, Kshatriya. Somebody protects the land. Then you get Vaishyas, the people who do commerce. And then it goes down the line. So they turned what was a system of differentiation of jobs, of careers. They turned it into some crazy racist theory. All nonsense, folks. Don't buy it. All right, now that I've wasted our time on ridiculous things which you might read in textbooks or people say in public, and people say these things, and they're supposedly eminent historians or respected historians, it's complete nonsense. We've disproven all of this stuff. Okay, so next epic after Ramayana, Mahabharata. Now, how many people know we have archaeological evidence for Mahaba? Raise your hand. So once again, these were people, these were kingdoms. The story we got is based on real history, and we have all those locations, and we have the information about it. And it was written up voluminously. In fact, there's probably no other ancient civilization that wrote about an epic in such detail as Mahabharata. Even the Iliad and Odyssey you can fit inside Mahabharata, okay? Panini. How many people have heard of Panini? Okay, there's some theories that he was post-Buddha, but I think if you look at the data, he was clearly pre-Buddha. Because he describes kingdoms, and he describes the kings, and he described a situation which was before Buddha. So once again, all of the stuff about our history books ignoring everyone's name until you get to Buddha is highly disrespectful. Remember that. If I say you no longer have a name, you're just a miscellaneous person, that's disrespectful, okay? And he actually formalized grammar. So there was Sanskrit long before him. A lot of people call it Vedic Sanskrit or Chandas, and he formalized it and created a whole bunch of rules. And by the way, people say he's the first grammarian. Long before the Greeks, Romans, anybody was Panini. He was an expert grammarian. How many people heard of Mahavir? Okay, so now we get to the time of Mahavir, and there's also tremendous archaeological data for that. Then we have the period of Buddha. I'm sure everyone has heard of Buddha. And by the way, Americans are, this is kind of where Americans are a little bit aware, once again, because of the whole education, academia. They're aware of Buddha. But they're not really aware of anything before that. Everything before that's kind of vague and foggy. Emperor Ashok. How many people heard Emperor Ashok? How many people have seen Ashok's name with the word king in front of it? King Ashok. Yeah, it's not a king, he's an emperor. Big difference. Emperor means there are kings who are beneath you. Kings who basically report to you, okay? Use the correct word. He was an emperor. I actually kind of admire his grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, because he's the one who kind of made the original push, expansive empire, and then Ashok just expanded it a little bit. Now here's what happened with Indian history, where it took a turn from Chinese history. The Chinese kept their empire pretty much intact, okay? They always kept that empire going. In India's case, the empire, after Ashok and his children, the empire collapsed. And then we gave into a period of, like, you could say, warring kingdoms. If India had maintained an empire from Ashok onward to today, what would history have looked like? It would have been very different. But the empire fell apart. Aryabhat. How many people have heard of Aryabhat? How many people have heard of zero? Anybody here heard of zero? Anybody heard of the base 10 system? Right? Or calculation of pi? I mean, we owe so much mathematics to Aryabhat. And you notice I put a 1 after his name because there were other Aryabhats in history, okay? This is one of the panels in the museum. We couldn't do all of our computers, we couldn't do any mathematics, we couldn't do anything without these basic things, which were studied and analyzed and organized by Aryabhat. How many people have heard of Shankaracharya? So he was an amazing person. He lived a short life. And during that short life, he went all over India, and he debated with everybody, and he won these debates, and he basically kept Sanatana Dharma, what we call Hinduism, he kept it alive. If it wasn't for him, it's possible that India would have become really more Buddhist. And if it had, how much resistance would there have been to later Islamic invasions? Because if you look at Afghanistan, that used to be Buddhist. What is it now, right? So I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Shankaracharya. He did incredible work, almost single-handedly saved Sanatana Dharma. And once again, changed history. How many people have heard of Vijayanagar dynasty? Today that location is called Hampi. So it was an incredibly huge city. People fought very hard. This is all part of that Islamic colonialism. I'll call it colonialism 1.0, whereas I'll call the British colonialism 2.0. So this whole phase that lasted over 1,000 years of the Hindu Holocaust, this is a real part of it. It was an incredible empire. They put up an incredible fight, and in the end, they were destroyed. Okay, Mughal Empire, I'm sure we've heard of that. Taj Mahal is a big tourist thing. And think about the marketing that goes behind this. All of us who've been to India have seen hundreds of buildings as impressive or more impressive than Taj Mahal. But the only one foreigners know about is Taj Mahal. This is marketing. This is public relations. We need to learn marketing and public relations. How many people have heard of Maratha Empire? Maratha Empire was to a large extent called the Maratha Hindu Empire, okay? These guys went, starting from Pune in western Maharashtra, and went and conquered in many directions, and they defeated many Islamic kingdoms. Once again, they did things which other people said, well, you can't do that, and they went ahead and did it, okay? Now, this is the part of history the Indians have forgotten, I think. Just like the Dasharajnya, Indians have forgotten it. Indians have forgotten that they're early Europeans, and they were visiting India and doing commerce and doing trade for something like 400 years before the British came. The British were late comers onto the scene, just like here in North America, right? New York City wasn't British, it was Dutch. It was called New Amsterdam, right? And the Dutch tried to defend themselves against the British, so they built a big wall, and the British eventually broke that wall, and that's what we have called Wall Street. Wall Street, okay? So the British were latecomers. So all these different European groups were vying for commerce with India. Why? Because at this point in history, Europe was poor, and India and China were rich. Now think about this. They were poor, so they were forced to do something. So they made these terrible little boats. They were nothing compared to Indian and Chinese boats. Took a big risk. Went all over the world to do commerce, and that commerce eventually became military interactions. If India and China had the same attitude of, hey, you know what? Let's go and explore the whole world, history would have been different. We all know about British colonialism. Once again, it was at the tail end of European expansion. And the British very often had to not only fight Indians, but they had to fight other European powers to get a stronghold within India. And it was a very slow, painful process. And it started with commerce. And if you look at all the writing about India from the European perspective, it was very positive. It was glowing positive. Like they would bring back reports and say, oh my God, this country's beautiful. This country's rich. There's no slavery in this country. There's no slaves. And in our civilization, we have slaves for thousands of years. This is amazing. These people live at peace. How did they do it? They had nothing but positive things to say, okay? But then, once it got political, and once you got governments involved, everything changed. Okay, early independence. As soon as India got independence, war. There was war in the north, war in the northeast, war all over the place. And the country was, at that point, very poor and having a tough time just feeding everybody, let alone fighting all these wars at all the borders. So, this PowerPoint presentation is like almost 10 years old. So when I say, modern India, I said up to 2013, because that's when I originally put this PowerPoint. And I can't believe it's 10 years old now. So, people look at modern situation in India and they say, what's going to happen in India, right? There's so many problems happening at the same time. And once again, you can see this slide I put together in India Today for 2014-2016. And I tried to show a couple things juxtaposed. I showed some modern infrastructure. I showed, Modi meeting with the U.S., IT, office park, some good things happening. And then we talk about what is the future going to be. It's very hard to predict the future. The only thing you can guarantee is that you're going to be wrong. That's the only thing you guarantee. Try to predict, you're going to be wrong. But I think if we look at the world at a very broad sense, we see that the power that used to be in Asia and that left Asia and then went to the West is slowly shifting back to Asia. Okay? It's a slow process. It may take a few hundred years overall, but it's shifting back to Asia. And sometimes people focus on the negative things, right? They look at India and they say, oh my God, look at all these people from villages crowding into the cities, creating slums. By the way, that's a completely normal process. Anybody here read Charles Dickens? Okay, the whole history of London was like that picture on the top left. It was a gigantic slum surrounding the Queen of England who lived in a palace. That's the way cities start. They start out with people coming in from villages, they have no money, and slowly the city gets developed. It takes a long time. We had the whole world shut down for 2 years for COVID. It was horrific. We had wars in India on the left side with Pakistan, on the right side with China. So it's very easy to look at the situation and say, man, what's the future going to hold? It looks pretty bad. But here's my take on it, and you're only going to hear this probably from me. Everybody else will hear. If you turn on the news, you're going to see negativity. If you read books, negativity. If you go on the internet, negativity. I'm probably one of the few people out there who will give you an unbelievably positive future. I think the future is going to surprise us. I think it's going to be much better than we could imagine. I think we're going to be sitting there 50 years from now looking back at today and say, who could have imagined such an incredible future? Now, why do I say that? Is it because people are magically going to become good overnight? No. I think there are going to be technological changes and there's going to be cultural changes worldwide, okay? And we can see that. India's got a very good starting point. It's the largest democracy on earth. I've already told you it's the oldest continuous civilization on earth. It has a growing economy. And the good thing about the Indian economy is India is full of business people and accountants, okay? And they are watching the numbers. They are watching every rupee, every penny. Whereas if you look at the Chinese economy, it's centrally controlled by this Marxist, fascist, dictator government. And they lie, and lie. So you never know exactly what's really going on, okay? So I have much more faith in the Indian economy growing slowly and steadily, basically being very honest, versus the Chinese economy, which looks like they're going to the moon, and then they crash. And then they'll crash and they'll be down like Japan was down for like 10, 20 years. That's the way they're going to crash. I think what I'm seeing is people in India are slowly learning lessons from the past. Right? If you don't defend yourself, somebody else is going to steal your lunch. Guaranteed. Okay? I think they're learning it. And I think India's starting to take a global leadership role. If you look at the non-aligned movement, it was a failure. Part of that might have been it was too early. But we have today, we have something called the BRICS. B-R-I-C-K. How many people have heard of BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a bunch of other countries have joined. What they're all doing is essentially going behind major powers like India and saying, you know what, we're not going to base our commerce on the US dollar, we're going to trade amongst ourselves in different currencies. That might sound like a small thing, but it's earth-shattering, because it means the American empire is going down, and it's going down rapidly. And what's going to replace it is not going to be some other empire, it's going to be more of a multipolar world. So, there's two kinds of power in this world. There's hard power and there's soft power. Hard power is you go in with your guns and with your weapons and you kill everybody and you take over a country and you enslave everybody. That's hard power. Hard power always looks very good in the beginning. It looks very powerful, it looks very frightening. But if you go back later, 100 years later, whatever, it's gone. It's all gone. But what lasts is soft power. Soft power is cultural power. And that is what India has. India has unlimited reserves of soft power. And I think as that goes out to the world, I think it's changing the world. And I'm much more optimistic about soft power than I am hard power. Last line there, you see that I talk about multi-planetary future. If anybody here has watched a TV show or a movie, Star Trek or Star Wars, anybody seen that? That's what I think our future is. I really do. And I think in the future, I think those people, like if you watch Star Wars, there's actually a book called The Dharma of Star Wars. Those people are following a dharmic culture, right? It's not an Abrahamic culture, it's a dharmic culture. It's not dogmatic. It's very not only intellectual, but it's very inquisitive. People are very curious about the universe. They're going out, they're exploring, they're learning new things every day. And I really feel that's going to become the culture going forward. So that's my brief history of India.